Thank you, Louisa. The International Civil Aviation Organization is aiming for net zero by 2050, and it has indicated that SAF will contribute to about 65% of the emissions reductions required. Now, we all know that the SAF markets are poised to grow quite exponentially, and so far, Europe and the US have dominated headlines in terms of industry development and technology development. However, it is equally important that we talk about the potential of SAF in Asia, because this is where most of the aviation sector's growth will take place in the next few decades. Today, I'm joined by panelists who are active in shaping the SAF landscape in Asia, and we will discuss the outlook for SAF in our region, the socio-economic benefits of a SAF industry for Asia, as well as the challenges that need to be resolved before SAF can actually scale to reach its full potential. So let's start off with policy, as with everything. Often the catalyst that resolves every chicken and egg discussion when we talk about new supply chains. So Daniel, the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore most recently launched the Sustainable Air Hub Blueprint. I think you go even further to also have policies that catalyze SAF production or the SAF industry, and you go even further to say that you will tax or put a levy on passengers, right? You would tax average people like me, right? What were you thinking?
Okay. We were thinking of the future. I think the key point here is that actually we are in a region where aviation is expected to grow. And certainly in Singapore, we are making massive investments in Terminal 5. So it is really a story about growth. But at the same time, we also recognize that it is important for us to take a balanced approach and to also be responsible for carbon emissions. So try to strike a balance, and also because Singapore is in a region where actually there has not been a lot of policy intervention, so we are also concerned about the potential competitive impact if we are too aggressive. That's why we have taken the approach of a fixed cost envelope. So it is a fixed levy. It is not a mandate, as you would understand in the European context, where there's a fixed percentage blend that almost you have to achieve at any cost. Airlines will have to, if it's 6%, airlines must take a 6% uplift at any cost. If they can't buy it, they pay penalties for that. We're not doing that approach. We're taking a fixed levy, a fixed cost, and all the levies will flow back to CAAS, and we will use that to buy SAF. The main advantage we see is, firstly, we are fixing the cost for everyone. So there isn't a problem of coordination or competitive disadvantage from certain airlines who want to do more. Of course, if more airlines want to do more, we're quite happy for them to do that. But for everyone flying out of Singapore, say Singapore Bangkok, all airlines will charge indicatively is $3 in economy class. So it is a fair system for everyone. At the same time, it solves the problem of coordination. The $3 will be used to buy SAF. If SAF prices are high, we'll just buy less. We are not chasing a 1% target per se, but if because of demand aggregation, the fact that we are located in perhaps a lower cost production area, we are able to secure lower SAF prices, then perhaps we'll exceed our target. But the idea is that with demand aggregation, and also because as CAAS will be helping to manage this central procurement, we will have potentially a better forecast of the cash flows. We have greater long-term demand certainty. Potentially, we can also secure lower costs through longer-term offtakes as well. So that is an approach that we think can help us start this transition towards greater use of a more expensive choice of fuel, but at the same time, mitigating some of the competitive impact that we are concerned about.
Thanks, Daniel. Do you think your counterparts in the region will also do the same?
I think there are conversations going on. I mean, just 2 weeks back, I was in the Philippines just sharing about our blueprint. I would say that different countries will take different approaches. I think this approach makes sense for Singapore because we are one country, two airports, perhaps traditionally a society where government takes a larger role in managing some of these strategies and interventions. If you're looking at larger, I mean, if you're Indonesia, you might have to take a different approach because the dealing with problems of a large country, multiple airports, so a different approach might be necessary. But I would say that all these countries are starting to think about it. We have had a lot of conversations at ASEAN level among the aviation authorities. We all have different ways of trying to approach this problem, but I think the consciousness is there.
Thank you. And just a gentle reminder for all of you to also give your questions into the Slido. Don't forget you're also getting text, so please feel free to ask. Okay, now with policy comes often demand, right? The Association for Asia Pacific Airlines announced a resolution, I think it was late last year, to target 5% SAF utilization by 2030. Subhas, how much SAF demand will that catalyze?
Well, we talk about demand. Of course, the resolution was passed basically to indicate the level of demand for the airlines, because the world of aviation passed a resolution in 2022 to achieve net zero emissions reduction by 2050. Then after that, what next? So the association has committed to, as a group, use up 5% of SAF as a demand signal. But actually, the problem is not demand. The problem is actually supply. Because airlines are using up every single drop of SAF that is available. So how do we get supply to ramp up to meet the demand of the airlines? As long as there is travel demand, airlines will demand fuel, and as the world becomes more sustainable, airlines would also have to adopt sustainable aviation fuel. So at the moment, the SAF that is being produced is mainly produced by dedicated SAF suppliers like Neste, which is also represented on this panel. But the elephant in the room, or rather the elephant that is not in the room, is actually the oil and gas majors. None of the big fuel companies, have started to actually transition to SAF in a big way. So the resolution is actually to also, try and ramp up the production of SAF. Of course, governments will also have to play a part. Governments have to be more proactive. In this regard, I think most of the SAF that is being produced today is in the US. And I think the policy tools that have been employed by the US has a lot to do with it. We talk about mandates from the European Union, but the airlines for Europe just complained last week that there is no SAF to be had in spite of the mandates. So we need governments to do something that is proactive. And I think the Singapore government's approach is to make SAF available in Singapore for airlines to make use of. So how much SAF are we talking about? 5%. In 2024, we will have 0.5% of the global SAF demand by 2050, which is about 1.5 million tons. Which means that for 5% for the whole world, it will be about 15 million. And Asia-Pac being about 35%, we reckon about 5 million tons for Asia-Pac Airlines by 2030. ICAO has also passed a resolution to reduce the intensity of aviation carbon by 5%. And some of the projections suggest that it will be around 6 million tons for Asia Pacific. So 5 to 6 million tons. The whole industry is actually aligned along these lines. We just need the oil companies to start producing.
Yeah, I think that's a few Neste plants to go, right? I think it's interesting you said that the supply is the issue. I think just last year when I come to such conferences, suppliers will complain there's no demand. Then today there's no supply. But anyway, let's move on to the suppliers then. Now, Pradeep, we have an Asian company who is going to set up a JV in Europe, right? And Neste, we have a European company who opened shop here in Asia. So one of you have to have gotten it right, okay? Now, but jokes aside, starting with you, Stephen. Now, you guys announced the opening of, I think, the single largest SAF plant in the world late last year, I think. But what's interesting is the decision to make that investment actually goes back before 2020.
2018.
Right. That was when none of whatever Daniel nor Subhas said even existed. I think it's also fair to say that whatever we see in Europe today didn't really exist then as well. So what drove that gutsy decision to land such a big plant in Singapore?
Well, I guess one word to start with, that's one of Neste's 3 C's, which is courage. So that was perhaps behind the decision. But before I go into what prompted the decision, I would say it's not whether Pradeep and his team have got it right or we have got it right to be here in Asia. I think whether we set up our plants in Asia or in Europe or in some other part of the world, the reality is that we need more plants producing sustainable aviation fuel, and we also need plants looking at new technologies. So I think that's something we need to be mindful of. I think for Neste, it is largely coming from the learnings we had from the road transport industry, because way back in 2007, we took a final investment decision to set up a plant here in Singapore that would at that time manufacture about 800,000 tons of renewable diesel, because we could see that in Europe and of course in the United States with the low carbon fuel standard, there was a demand for renewable diesel. So this kind of prompted the decision that Singapore being where it was, sort of as a logistics hub, it made sense for us because a lot of the feedstock that we were using was coming from this part of the world, so the Asia Pacific region. You go west, you hit Europe. You go east, you hit the west coast of the United States, where the demand really exists for renewable diesel. So that decision paid off really well, and we've sort of upscaled that plant to go from 800,000 tons in 2010 to 1.3 million tons in 2022. And of course, taking a final investment decision in 2018 when no policies existed around aviation really took a lot of courage. It took a lot more courage because in 2020, we were all hit by this pesky virus called Corona that came and caused all sorts of troubles. Demand for aviation went down as well. But obviously that decision has now paid off. We've seen the EU refuel initiative that will see a 2% sustainable aviation fuel mandate kick in by 2025, going up to 6% by 2030. In the United States, you have the Inflation Reduction Act, and that is driving demand for sustainable aviation fuel. And Japan, last year, in May, announced a 10% sustainable aviation fuel target that would kick in by 2030. And of course, Singapore has really come to the table as well, with starting off with a 1% target by 2026 and then gradually rising. So I think there is demand for it, but as Subhas has also said, we need more sustainable aviation fuel, and you need not 10, you need probably 20 Neste site plants very soon.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think that's a good segue into Pradeep, right? Latest announcement on the block, right? New JV with Spanish energy company Cepsa on a plant in Spain, right? Could you talk us through that decision and what SAF means for Apical?
Sure, thank you. So Apical is one of the largest feedstock supplier globally in the form of agri-based waste and residue. As an integrated veg oil processor, we're able to extract both efficiently as well as sustainably the waste and residue from our supply chain. So that has helped us build that supply chain well and brought in the credibility. We're one of the largest supplier to Neste as well. We've been in the production of biodiesel since 2010. That's from traditional veg oil. However, both in Indonesia as well as in Spain. But in the last 4 or 5 years, we have converted the unit to be able to handle waste and residue into renewable diesel, HVO. not necessarily HVO, but renewable diesel. A month ago, we broke ground in Huelva, Spain, to build Southern Europe's largest sustainable aviation fuel site, 500,000 tons at $1 billion investment. So maybe to address Subhas's concern in respect to how quickly you can get in. Unfortunately, the investments that go into these units are rather huge. It's humongous, right? So you need to make sure that we have the commitment as well as the demand and the supply. But the good news is that, to what Subhas said, so if you look at ASEAN and particularly Singapore, ASEAN, it's extremely important because you have Indonesia, Thailand, as well as Malaysia, which are the 3 largest palm oil producing countries. Collectively, they produce something like 70 million tons. And if you assume a 10% waste and residue possibility to be extracted, that's 7 million tons. That will hopefully resolve our problem in Southeast Asia. And given that Singapore is the most significant aviation hub, as well as bunkering hub as well, right? So we must not forget that too, because I think the bunker fuel demand is a lot more than aviation as well. But all given, all said and done, I think it's important part, and Singapore can play a very significant and meaningful role.
Yeah, and since we're talking about elephants today, I mean, in addition to the energy majors, I think big feedstock capabilities are required, and I think let's save time to talk about palm and the relevance of palm in Asia's SAF story later, right? But now turning back to Daniel and Subhas, so based on what you've said, we are looking at around about a 5% blend or 5% future come 2030. Do you think it's possible?
I think it is possible. It's not going to be easy. It's a tough ask, but it's not impossible. You know, if you really look at it, we talked about the oil majors. You know, I think governments should consider, you know, whatever support they can provide to the dedicated SAF producers like our friends here. You know, because they are doing all the heavy lifting. So they need all the help they can, either in the form of subsidies or incentives. But there must also be some incentive for the traditional or conventional aviation fuel suppliers to come to the party. You know, they need some motivation to have some skin in the game. You know, so we have what is known as co-processing. You know, with just a small amount of input from SAF feedstock into the conventional fossil-based aviation fuel production, you can get as much as 5% SAF blend. You know, so achieving 5% is not impossible, but we need the all the players to play a part.
So next year we will up the resolution. No, but Daniel, so looking beyond 2030, right? I mean, your counterparts in Europe, they've set a roadmap all the way to 2050. Do you think that's possible for Asia?
I would say that, I mean, just going to what was mentioned around COVID and aviation, I think what was interesting is that even though aviation was very badly hit by COVID, the only thing that ICAO, which is the international body responsible for aviation, really spent a lot of time talking about in 2020, 21, 22, 23, all the way up to last year was sustainability. So in 2022 at the Assembly, we agreed on a net zero goal for 2050. Last year, we agreed on a 5% carbon intensity reduction for aviation fuels by 2030. I think what it shows is there is ambition, and the same ambition is actually being seen in Asia as well. I mean, within ASEAN, there's a lot of interest. I think when Singapore was responsible for the ASEAN air transport group of meetings, we started the sustainability forums to raise awareness. That was in 22-23. This year, Thailand has taken over chairmanship, and they have decided to continue that. So I think in next month, all the ASEAN aviation regulators will meet in Bangkok again to talk about sustainability. So there's a lot of push. I think everyone sees that this is necessary for the industry to get behind. Governments are also taking a stance. Countries, we hear Australia might make some moves, Japan has made some moves, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, we hear some signals coming out. So we do see, of course, the pace of change may not be as fast as some people might ask for, but I think the bravest step is actually just making the first step. So we started with 1%, right, 2026. Actually, the pathway to 2050, no one really knows, but at least we started with 1%. Hopefully it's an S-curve, we can really go fast, but I think once countries make a step, I think the pace of change will just accelerate.
Yeah, and I think just staying on the both of you, do you have an opinion on the role of book and claim and whether it will play an important role in catalyzing the industry here in Asia? And maybe I'll invite Daniel first to explain what book and claim is for.
Okay. So book and claim, of course, is the idea of, it's basically an accounting system that allows for the environmental attributes of SAF to be disaggregated from the physical SAF. So you could technically, if you pay the premium for the SAF, book the carbon reduction benefits, whereas the physical SAF becomes treated as fossil jet fuel, and then whoever buys it will not be able to claim the benefits. The idea is that in a world where supply is scarce, you want to be able to improve access. So rather than force airlines to find physical SAF, you can buy, it becomes more of a financial transaction. From our point of view, it makes a lot of sense. But there are, and last year we had a gathering of various international aviation leaders in Singapore. Earlier this year, there was actually a lot of confusion around book and claim, and there's also some concerns that in an environment where currently more supply is in the US and in Europe, a book and claim system could favor incumbent suppliers. So, for example, if tomorrow a country in Asia declares a SAF mandate, actually their fear is that all the supply will come out of Europe and US, and there will be very little economic benefits generated for the local economy. So there are some concerns, but it's really about trying to encourage everyone to think broader about the long term, but also, I guess, talking to the fuel producers is also to spread, geographical access to SAF. I think in a 2050 world, actually, there shouldn't be book and claim. There should be SAF available in every airport because you can't have fossil jet fuel anymore. But I think it's a matter of how we get there.
Yep. You want to add on to that?
Yeah, Nicholas, I think it is very important, because SAF is still, a drop-in fuel, and has the same qualities of aviation fuel. So what we are trying to do is on a life cycle basis, to see how much of carbon can be reduced in the use of SAF. So a book and claim is essential, because otherwise parties that are participating in the transition to SAF will not be able to claim the credit that is due to them. So it is very important. But book and claim system is being developed by the industry. Until it is fully enforced, you have CORSIA, and there is such a thing as CORSIA eligible fuels, which already allow airlines to make use of SAF, and start the ball rolling. So these are all baby steps, no doubt. But going back to elephants, I think the industry is like an elephant. Once it gets running, don't stand in its way. So you will get there. And I think aviation is a good sector for the governments to focus on, because it's a low-hanging fruit. The industry has come together. They've already been looking at sustainability for many years, since the early 2000s, and they've passed various resolutions. CORSIA is in play, they've passed the net zero emissions target, and all the parts of the aviation ecosystem have come together. So it's a drop-in fuel. But unfortunately, the renewable resources, 97% of them are being allocated to other sectors. So we need the governments to take the example of some of the other counterparts, to start moving in the same direction.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, and that was the first question from the floor. So gentle reminder for audience to continue sending your questions. There's another one actually from the floor, and that's for the producers here, right? So Neste, Stephen, you've got a huge plant here in Singapore. I'm sure trying to fill that plant with feedstocks is top of mind for you, right? So where do you find your feedstocks here in Asia?
Yeah, so we source our feedstocks from global. So it's a global sourcing that we have, and we have over 100 different suppliers that we've been sourcing from for a number of years. Again, I think one of the unique advantages that we have is that we've been sourcing these feedstocks here in Singapore since 2010 for the old Singapore refinery, if you like, and we've been working with partners like Apical and others. So I think that gives us an advantage in terms of the current feedstock pool. But I think it's also important to start looking at how we unlock future pools, because to meet the kind of demand that we're talking about, you're not going to be able to depend on the current technology, which is what we call HEFA technology, hydrotreated esters and fatty acids. So essentially waste oils and fats. Our sort of numbers that we've put together going to 2040 to 2050 shows that there's roughly about 50 million tons of oils and fats that will be available by 2050. Now that's definitely not going to meet the demand that is required by 2050 for sustainable aviation fuel. So we need to start focusing on new feedstocks. There are a number of feedstock pools, novel vegetable oils, municipal solid waste, algae oils, and then moving forward from there, powder liquids, hydrogen, etc., that need to be focused on. So, I mean, going back to my initial comment, about whether Pradeep made the right decision or whether we made the right decision, I think I stand by my view that we need more refineries to come on stream, and we need more producers to start focusing not only on current technologies, but also on new technologies. And to Subhas's point as well, we need to take a lot of these projects from an announcement phase to an actual FID phase. There's a very interesting map that is put together by Argus that shows the number of sustainable aviation fuel production facilities. And there are, I can't remember the exact number, but there's over 120 refineries that have been announced. There are 16 refineries that are actually producing. So we are not going to get to the scale we want with 16 refineries. We need that 120 plus to actually start producing.
So it's clear we need to do more, right? Pradeep, what's after Spain for you? How is Apical contributing to this discussion of doing more, growing the supply chain here in Asia?
So we have committed to 500,000 tons in south of Spain. We're looking at further opportunities here in Singapore as well as ASEAN. It's important for us, being the home base. So we'll continue to do that. And maybe to touch on the feedstock side of things, and the elephant in the room, which is palm. Look, the 10% I initially said about the waste and residue possibility, it's just for the HEFA technology only. Yeah, it's the liquid waste and residue that's available that can be used for the HEFA. And like what Stephen said, there are other technologies that has to come into play. And today, the largest feedstock that goes into burning in the energy and the electricity sector in Japan is all from what you call as palm kernel shell, right? It's the shell that you get out of just before the crushing process starts. Now, all of that, the solid, can be converted to liquid fuels as well. So there are various other opportunities. And I think while we discuss about the possibility of feedstock and everyone seems to be very concerned about it, rightly so as well, the availability, but it's also important for countries to continue to put enough funding into the research of alternative fuels. And what's important and what's fair for Southeast Asia is palm-based waste and residue.
Yeah.
That's it. And the adaptability is very, very easy.
So we've spoken about palm waste residues, we've spoken about other waste residues, but we know that Asia is the largest producer of palm oil, right? Palm actually is a very efficient crop, right? But palm has not been widely accepted globally, right? Do you think that in the future, when we've exhausted our current options of waste and residues, that we would actually be a bit more open to considering crude palm oil as a feedstock, right?
Good you asked him that question.
Yeah. And maybe let's take turns to go down.
So, look, we are off. If you take palm oil, it again produces 5 tons per hectare compared to bean oil or any other competing oil which does less than 1 or 1.5 tons per hectare. I don't think we solicit the fact of using edible oil for energy purposes. I think that's not the starting point. The starting point should be, let's use up all the waste and residue that's available in whatever technology form it can be adapted to. Let's make use of that. And then let's discuss about whether there is sufficient available oil after feeding the world for food. Then we go to that. But I think COSIA is very clear with that.
Yeah.
They have done a proper life cycle analysis, and they have recommended all the waste and residue that must be adapted. And I think that is sufficiently enough for at least 2030. Let's get to 2030 first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's get there, and then I'm sure there'll be sufficient amount of money that will go into the technologies.
Yeah. I'll spare you on this one.
No, and I just want to add to Pradeep's comment. I fully agree with Pradeep. I mean, it's great that COSIA looks at the waste and residue from the palm oil milling process. I think it's going to be challenging to take, as Pradeep says, something that's a food, a food product and convert that into fuel. But I think even if you look at the current feedstock pool, and a lot of it is animal fat and used cooking oil that is currently used, there's huge potential even in used cooking oil that is untapped. And a good example of this is India, where we carried out a study a couple of years ago with the Observer Research Foundation, which is a government think tank. And what that study found was that 70% of the used cooking oil in India goes back into the food system, and it continues to be recirculated within the food system. Now, studies independently done by the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas in India says that there's roughly about 3 to 5 million tons of UCO that could potentially be available in India. In 2022, they collected less than 100,000 tons. So there is potential. Again, it's about policies and regulation that would then also enable access to those feedstocks.
So actually, when we develop a SAF industry, it's very clear that we are not just trying to develop a clean fuel to put into a tank, right? There are cheaper ways to decarbonize aviation, frankly speaking, right? But governments are still pushing forward with this agenda. So clearly there are externalities beyond just decarbonizing aviation that's causing governments to move in this direction. Now, I think I'll pose this question to every one of you. What externalities or what external benefits beyond decarbonizing aviation are your organizations most excited about that's causing you to work so hard to catalyze the SAF industry? Maybe I'll start from Daniel first.
Well, I guess if you look at feedstock, actually a lot of feedstock in Southeast Asia will be agricultural in nature, so there are definitely potential benefits to local population, local communities in terms of creating new economic value over what is traditionally seen as a waste product. But I think more broadly it's about the fact that in this part of the world, actually, there's not many alternative options to air travel. And the whole idea of decarbonizing air travel is also tied to the externalities that air travel brings to connecting what is largely a maritime kind of environment, lots of little islands, connecting people, creating economic opportunities, and that's why we need decarbonized air travel. We want, in Asia, we cannot curtail air travel because it is an absolute necessity. So it's a question of how do we make air travel more sustainable and more responsible.
Subhas?
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that point, if you take the last 2 decades to 2020, connectivity as measured in unique city pairs doubled, while airfares, halved, even though it doesn't feel like it today. But that is the truth, and aviation brings those benefits. And we cannot just do away with aviation in the Asia-Pacific region, because it is, not a contiguous region, and many economies and communities depend on aviation. Then, of course, all the other job and income streams that come with it, and most importantly, now any country can be a fuel producer.
Pradeep?
I'll touch on Daryl's and Subhas's point on communities. Indonesia is the largest producer of palm oil. 40% of Indonesia's palm oil comes from smallholders, which is anything from 2 hectares to 4 hectares. There are 19 million farmers who have palm plantations or palm growing that's going on. So hence, I think it's very important to take them along in this journey. We as feedstock suppliers or the producers of SAF cannot be only enjoying the margins that comes along with it. It must flow through, and we must, as the influential midstream supply chain partners, we must focus on how do you pass that on and how do you improve their cultivations and agriculture practices so that we can take them along in that journey as well. And that's very important for us, and we put a lot of focus there.
Thank you, Pradeep. Stephen?
No, to echo what everyone has said, I mean, aviation is critical in this part of the world, in ASEAN. I mean, Singapore would not have been able to have the exclusivity with Taylor Swift if you didn't have air travel, because the rest of the people in ASEAN or in the Asian region wouldn't have been able to make it down here. But in all seriousness, I think what's critical here in terms of course, the social benefits that it brings is also we are dealing with climate change, and we need to tackle climate change. And aviation is a global sector. It continues to, as the sector grows, the emissions also continue to grow. And we are seeing emissions from other sectors, with EVs, with the use of biofuels for road transport, etc. There's an expectation that those emissions will come down. A lot of countries have bought in policies that will only see EVs by 2035, 2040. For aviation, which is a hard-to-abate sector, while there is work on technologies like electric planes and hydrogen-powered planes, those are very, very long-term solutions, and the current solution is sustainable aviation fuel. So how do we ramp that up? That's really critical.
Yeah, thanks guys. I think it's a good time to bring our panel to a wrap, but maybe just let me share 3 key takeaways I had from this discussion, right? So I think number 1, we're seeing that the Asian community is becoming more alive to this whole SAF story than before. We're seeing very tangible signs that the industry is growing here in Asia. And number 2, we've spoken a lot about feedstock, right? I think the abundance of feedstock or biogenic feedstock in our region makes Asia a very fertile place to actually develop the SAF industry. However, I think we also recognize that it's going to take some time, right? We're talking about creating new supply chains here. We're not just putting oil into a machine and turning it on. And I think the last thing that we discussed was this. Beyond decarbonizing aviation, we should all support the growth of a SAF industry because it encourages socioeconomic growth, uplifting of smallholder farmers, uplifting of marginalized communities, increasing circularity, and potentially one day even incentivizing sustainable palm oil practices here in Asia. So long-winded way of saying, the next time you get on a plane here in Singapore, you're going to get taxed, but know that you're going to be paying for a very good cause. All right, thank you everyone.